All right, thanks for coming here today. I really appreciate this panel. It's a really exciting panel on tackling water affordability through a justice lens. This panel is being recorded. And if you'd like continuing legal education credits, I will put the link in the chat. So I'm really excited to have our two speakers today, Jeremy Orr from NRDC and Brianna Parker from Elevate. So if you want to introduce yourselves and get started, we'll be recording and we'll make this available later as well. I don't know, when do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I can start and then I'll pass it over to Brianna and we'll get the slide deck pulled up. So my name is Jeremy Orr. I'm a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where I work on our Safe Water Initiative, which is kind of our source to tap drinking water contamination program. I primarily work on Safe Drinking Water Act enforcement on a number of different issues, with a big focus on lead in drinking water, PFAS, as well as access and affordability, issues as well. I'll pass over to Brianna.
Hello, everybody. My name is Brianna Parker. I work at Elevate, and we are a nonprofit organization with the mission of smart energy use for all. We focus on water affordability and water efficiency, and we help partners across the region with water affordability, the water affordability crisis. And we're excited to have you all today. So, hey, let's get into it.
So I'll pull up the.
And I just got a couple of requests for the link. Why don't we give it 1 minute and then we'll start again. So one sec. I'm gonna just really quick hop off on to see if the other link. Sorry, Kendra, did that link even work for you?
Yeah, the one you just sent me did, but the 2 meeting confirmations I got when I registered, neither of those links worked.
Got it. All right. We're just gonna give it 1 minute and then we're gonna restart because I think the wrong link. All right, let's keep going and then I'm going to work on getting that link sent out. So sorry, Jeremy and Brianna had introduced themselves. So go ahead.
All right, so I'm going to pull up the slide deck now, share the screen with you all, and we can kind of go over the agenda and jump right into the presentation today. And can you all see that okay? Great. So today we'll be tackling, water affordability with a, justice lens. The agenda will, kind of look like the introductions, which we've already done. We want to talk a bit about defining equity and justice and water affordability in kind of 2 different contexts. And then Brianna will talk about, leading and learning from communities as it relates to water affordability. I'll share a bit about the national perspective of what drinking water access and affordability looks like, kind of nationwide, and then talk about, what states are doing in particular, some affordability work that's taking place in Illinois. And then we'll, save time for, Q&A and wrap up, from there.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I see. Hello, Kendra. So defining equity and justice and water affordability. So the first thing I like to say is equity and justice and water affordability means that water is like essential to life. It's a human right. So I think it's just important context before we move forward. Jeremy, could you go back 1 slide? Okay. Water affordability, it relates to the ability of the customer to pay their water bill. It's the function of two things: the cost of service and a customer's income. Water burden is the understanding that it's understanding that water burden is related to poverty and income inequality, because income inequalities and unaffordable water bills, customers have to make trade-offs, trading off essential need for another essential need. And we know water is the most essential need. So they're trading off groceries to pay their water bill, food to pay their water bill, and other things. And so I'm gonna be referencing a report from Elevate, Metropolitan Planning Council, and Illinois Sea Grant. It's called Water Affordability in Northeastern Illinois, Addressing Water Equity in a Time of Rising Costs. I just wanted you guys to know from that report, it was found that most people, most communities that are water burdened have other issues, and they are making these trade-offs. So just wanted to reference that. Jeremy, I'll kick it to you.
So, as we define water affordability, we also kind of want to define like the equity and justice piece of that, right? So especially when we think of it in an environmental and public health context, it's important to kind of always understand, how we define environmental justice, right? Which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Right. So that's how we define environmental justice. But we also have to kind of separately define what injustice and what inequity looks like, in this, kind of in this field and in this work. And we see injustice as the broad systems of oppression that occur in kind of social, political, governmental, business, and other institutions, right? They are systems of oppression that have kind of permeated society in our country, really since before our country was even a country, right? It's both systemic and systematic. And then also when we think about, issues of kind of environmental justice or even environmental racism, especially as we talk about water affordability, which, we'll see today that a lot of it is, divided along race and ethnicity, right, of who gets the brunt of these issues. So when we look at the definition of this from Dr. Robert Bullard, who's considered the father of environmental justice, he kind of defines it as any environmental policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individual groups or communities based on color.
All right, Jen, I'm gonna ask for your help. I'm gonna show a quick clip, and then I'll get back to this slide. It's about learning from communities. What does that look like? What does that look like in practice? So I'll show this quick.
Great. And I apologize. I see people joining now. We did send out the wrong link for the registration. So folks are joining now, and we'll definitely send this recording out afterward. But I will share my screen now. Oops, and I will show your little video. And don't get stressed out by how many tabs I have open, please. All right, here we go.
From miles and miles. The watering facility is where people have to drive in from miles and miles and miles and miles with their water barrels. They drive underneath the water facility, they turn on the water.
The longest I've gone without running water at one time has been 8 weeks.
I started to keep all of these water quality violations every single quarter, every single year, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2006,
I got 2 cemeteries on the back hill back here of family members that we've lost to cancer.
EPA was like, look, you live in coal mining country and coal mining's dirty business. That was a direct quote. Barium, arsenic, vanadium.
So it's like an alphabet soup of the periodic table.
Silicosis, pneumoconiosis, radiation fibrosis. We are left with millions of cubic yards of radioactive materials that is scattered down the mountainsides and to our lands, our pastures, our agricultural lands, our streams, our lakes.
To me, there's no such thing as quasi-sovereign. You're either sovereign or you're not.
The monoculture of corn, soybean, hog, it is the dominant force in Iowa politics. They want to externalize the costs of production by putting a mess in the river that those of us downstream who depend on those rivers for drinking water have to finance to clean up.
Ms. Trader called me $114,000. We don't have a septic tank. It's cost more than his house worth right now.
This is along the Selma to Montgomery Marsh Trail. Every year, business people get on the bus and go and worship at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But all along off these side roads where people are living in conditions that are akin to places around the world that don't have the kind of wealth that exists in this country, it makes absolutely no sense.
On behalf of the 120,000 families who are getting their water turned off, we're following the crews and turning the water back on.
You can't say and do bad things to welfare recipients unless you put a narrative out there. They would rather pay for cable than water. And you have to say that over and over and over and over again.
2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2013.
I think I'll probably die thinking that I ain't done enough.
2015, 2016, 2017.
What do we get for what we gave? And survival should be the bare minimum.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and if you guys want to go ahead.
Okay, thank you for sharing. So the previous slide is just talking about learning from communities, and that's a film that is coming out in the fall. But learning from communities means listening to them, because the issues that's coming up in communities, they're coming up with solutions. And so partnering with communities and learning and unlearning and relearning with communities is the point of the video. And one point that I wanted to make from the video, we can't talk about water affordability outside the context of water quality, because usually water quality and water affordability work hand in hand. We see places where there's super water quality issues and they're still not being able to afford their water bill. So just wanted to make that note. Back to that report that I'm referencing, it looked at racial disparities in Illinois, and it found that because of racial segregation and income inequality, which work hand in hand, that water affordability disproportionately affects BIPOC communities the most. In fact, it found that for majority white municipalities, it was only 23% water burden compared to 62% of majority BIPOC communities. And the last note is the cost of water is rising. We see infrastructure, becoming something that we have to look at. And therefore the price of water it's constantly rising, and communities aren't making more money. So we definitely have to pay close attention and come up with solutions. Next slide. That report also references strategies for addressing affordability and the rising costs. The first strategy, which Jeremy is gonna kind of get into, so I won't get into it too much, but reducing costs by leveraging fully leveraging the Clean Water Act funding programs. Believe that their water promote conservation efforts. Examples of water efficiency strategies are leak and detect and repair, retrofits and rebates, metering, design and implement equitable rates. Rate design recommendations include full cost rates based on periodic cost of service rates, considering reducing fixed rates, minimum bill, and provide lifeline rate to customers so they can explore rate strategies addressing affordability. The fourth is strengthen customer assistance programs. Now, there's a difference between affordability and assistance, but utilizing the assistance programs that and those programs that help with collection, that provide for equitable collection policies for low-income customers is essential. And then targeting hard to reach customers, arrearage, those customers that have arrearages, that are in crisis, targeting them, creating something around for them so that they can actually get into the program so they won't live without water. And with that, I will kick it to you, Drew.
So, I want to talk about kind of the national perspective of burdens and barriers to access, to affordable drinking water for communities in kind of two frames. One, I'm going to share a bit about, a study done by NAACP a couple of years ago that kind of looks at, some of the causes and the barriers or some of the impacts of unaffordable water, and then share a bit about the perspective of it in the midst of a pandemic and how that's kind of brought shed more light on the issue. So the NAACP Legal Defense Fund undertook a study a couple of years ago and produced a report called Watercolor, a study of race in the water affordability crisis in America's cities. And this was released in 2019, and it looked at the intersection of the cost of water and race, essentially, and found race to be, one of the marquee factors in unaffordable water. And in additionally, going back to something that Brianna said, which was, it's hard to look at, access or affordability of water without also looking at the quality of water. And what we also know from research that NRDC has done as well is that communities of color also suffer from more instances of water contamination violations, Safe Drinking Water Act violations for more contaminants as well, right? So we're thinking of one cost, but then also quality. And when we look at water rates that have dramatically risen nationally over the last 10 years, we see the primary reason for that is failing infrastructure. So that failing infrastructure, which is also the cause of kind of poor quality, is also the cause of water affordability issues. And breaking it down into more than that, two of the kind of the bigger reasons when we look at where communities are, the communities that struggle the most with water affordability, it's population loss, right, and it's political dynamics. And without going too deeply into it, when we think of population loss, a big part of that is flight, right? Flight to the suburbs and predominantly white residents, and over the years moving further away from urban cores where Black and brown residents will tend to live, and putting that cost burden essentially on on a lower population and lower income tax base. And then also political dynamics, right? I mean, we can give a few examples, right, of how political decision making impacts the cost of water. We think of for me, I think of a place like Detroit where political decision making, legal decision making burden the city, right, the Blackest city in America, with the majority of maintenance of one of the largest water systems, right, in America. There was a point over the years where residents of Detroit were responsible for paying for 87% of the water or 83%, I believe, of the water, and 17% of that fell on the suburbs, right? So the idea that literally an entire city, Black city, was subsidizing the water and sewage rates of every surrounding suburb that was also on that water system. So it's just, you know, some of the thoughts of political dynamics. But then when we think of some of the issues that then coincide or follow up subsequent to water affordability, we know that it disproportionately impacts communities of color, making this an environmental justice and racial justice issue. And what we do know is that these communities experience shutoffs at a higher rate, right? They experience service termination at a much higher rate. They experience arrearages, which is, you know, your bill continues to just add and add up, and when it's cut off, you still owe this, you know, this back bill that's in thousands. I know we seen somebody the other day in some of our work that had a bill of over like 20,000, right? Over $20,000 for an individual home, right? That's just like, that's absurd. And we also know that there are these property liens, right? That tend to come in some places, that tend to come with a lack of access to water, meaning that you know, I've gotten so far behind, I've gotten so far in arrearages that that cost is now being assessed on my property as a property tax, right? And what that lien leads to, you know, as you see here, is a loss of home. So we've seen in many places where a property lien based on nothing more than your inability to pay water can result in, you know, your home being foreclosed on, and you literally losing your home in many instances, which I know with partners that I work with believe to be unconstitutional foreclosures, right? But essentially your water bill can get high enough that it's added to your property tax. If I can't afford my water bill, there's a good chance I can't afford my property tax either, right? So it's very likely that I can lose my home, or if I'm renting, eviction, right? If I get behind on that bill and my, you know, my landlord, the owner of my property isn't willing to give me much more time, and it's falling, you know, it's falling and putting their property in jeopardy, they'll, you know, evict us. And then from that, one of the other things is this loss of family, right? And criminal prosecution, which I don't think a lot of people realize that one, you know, if you're shut off from water, I can't afford my water gets shut off, especially if I have, you know, young children in my home, you know, you can have protective services called on you and literally lose, you know, your children for an uninhabitable situation that you know, that you didn't cause, and that you don't, you know, you didn't welcome, right? But simply you just weren't able to afford your bill. And the other part of that, which we've seen, is criminal prosecution in many cases to avoid, you know, these type of you know, we talk about loss of family and children. To avoid it, you know, we've seen people turn their own water back on and been criminally prosecuted at some, you know, significant rates. I know a couple of years ago we were trying to get a gauge of like, how often does this happen? Like, how often are you prosecuting people criminally for simply wanting to have access to running water in their home? And one water utility simply didn't have the data, right? So they could tell us that they were criminally prosecuting people. They couldn't tell us how many. And the reason being was because they didn't want to have to report on it, right? Like they knew that if they kept, they weren't required to maintain that data. And they knew that if they kept it, they would have to report on it. And they were essentially, right, knowing that, you know, how crazy it sounded or how crazy it would look for them to have to report exactly how many people, which we figured could be a significant amount, they were criminally prosecuting for simply turning their own water back on. And then, you know, kind of a bit more on the national perspective, you know, specifically looking at kind of, you know, water affordability in the midst of the pandemic. So pre-COVID, like, this was already a problem. So a lot of, you know, the information that I shared with you all on the last slide was information that had been taken from, you know, the last, you know, 10 years or so in this report from NAACP and released a couple of years ago, right? And then, you know, we hit this pandemic and we realized that this problem is even bigger and is even more exacerbated. One thing that's really come out of this, what I think a lot of people hadn't realized, is as we were looking for more information and data on just how big this problem is in the midst of the pandemic, was like some communities are literally paying 3 times, you know, up to 3 times more than other communities. I think as Brianna mentioned, you know, particularly when you look at Northeast Illinois, we're talking about rates that over the last 10 years have increased 2 to 3 times, right? And that's, you know, not just, you know, that's not just, you know, in Chicagoland, right? But that's kind of around the state and around the country. I put this, Midwest versus Southwest is what still blows my mind is you can look at rates in the Southwest region, right, of the United States, where you have people paying, cities paying $400 annually, right, for water, right? So there are some cities in the Southwest that pay $400 annually for water. And mind you, we're also talking about places that are ridden with drought and are getting, 10 you would think would be paying more for water that's getting distributed and transported from further away. But yet we have Midwestern cities like Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Milwaukee, where you see folks paying annually upwards of $1,500 to $2,000 for water, right? So the idea that you can look at a place like maybe Phoenix, right, and the average person pays $400 for the full year, a place that barely has any water, right, pays $400 per year, but yet you look at, predominantly urban areas in other regions like the Midwest and the East Coast that have seen their rates rise more than 3 times over the last 10 years. And then with COVID, we realized that has exacerbated the issue of affordability. Like one of the stats that came out last year, since March, since kind of when the pandemic began, was that 1 in 5 Americans that were filing for unemployment were facing shutoff since the start of the pandemic, right? So that's 20% of folks actually applying for some sort of assistance were also saddled with a water bill that they couldn't pay. And that's a lot to begin with. But when we think of how many folks were laid off, how many folks were actually in real need of unemployment assistance over the last year, the idea that of that increased number, a significant number of those people still need it. We're still saddled with a unaffordable bill. And from the pandemic, I think we did see some things that begin to give us a little bit of hope in this work of affordability and access to drinking water, which is we've seen a number of temporary shut-off moratoriums around the country, and we've seen a number of mandates to reconnect people to drinking water who have been disconnected. As we were told at the very beginning of the pandemic, right, was the best thing you could do was wash your hands, stay home and wash your hands, right? That's hard to do when you don't have running water in your home, right? So I think a lot of states begin to realize the need for this and begin to make that direct connection between health and access to water, and they begin to take these steps. And unfortunately, many of them are only temporary. We've seen a lot of them already expire and not be renewed around the country, putting folks right back where they started in terms of still needing some sort of mechanisms to tackle access, in affordability. And I think, one of the things that has been good about this is that, these steps have kind of set a new precedence and opportunity for moving forward because, places, water utilities and our municipalities and leaders are unable to say they don't understand the connection, right, between health and water. Like we know it now, right? It's very prevalent. It's been expressed by, states and water systems around the country, over the last year. So we believe it's going to be hard to walk that back. So now the question becomes, how do we secure these rights, as Brianna called it, human rights to water? How do we secure them and continue to move that work forward, building on some of the victories that folks had in securing water, even if short term during the pandemic? And when we look at kind of what states are doing, I think one of those to look at would be, if I can go back, would be Illinois, right? I think they recently, about 2 years ago, passed a Illinois affordability study in the legislature. So it was a mandate to have the state produce a study on water rates around the state. It'd be led by the Government Finance Research Center at University of Chicago or University of Illinois Chicago. This bill, which was actually just funded in this past round, this past session of the legislature, is responsible for a couple of things. It's going to look at affordability and rates around the state. They're going to do it in 2 components. One is that Lake Michigan service area, which kind of Brianna mentioned, that Northeast Illinois area. They'll have a report that's due December of 2022. And then the rest of the state will be compiled in a report due December 2023. And this study will produce a report that looks at a number of different areas to address water affordability and make recommendations on how to tackle this issue. But the report should look at a few different things, the components of a water bill, reasons for increase in water rates, the definition of affordability throughout the state, and any variances of that definition, evidence of rate setting that utilizes inappropriate practices, the extent of which state or local policies drive cost increases or variations in rate settings, challenges within economically disadvantaged communities and water rate setting, and then opportunities for increased intergovernmental coordination for setting equitable water rates. So what we're seeing is the state of Illinois saying, okay, we're going to look at this problem, figure out what the actual problem is, what the burden is, and make some recommendations on how we can fix it. I think that's promising, right? That you have states that are beginning to address that issue, and in particular as well, one of the things that Brianna mentioned, there's a difference between affordability and assistance, but also recognizing that assistance does play a role in making sure people have access to water. So Illinois also, this past legislative session, as part of their lead service line replacement bill that was passed a low-income water affordability or water assistance program, right? It's the first of its kind in the country. Like, no state has a statewide water assistance program. So that'll be, in addition to replacing their pipes, lead pipes, which is a landmark legislation, this low-income assistance program is as well, because it at least gives folks an opportunity to continue to have access to water while we figure out the affordability piece of this as well. I think that is it. I think we could take any questions.
Thanks, everybody. Anybody have questions? And I apologize for this mishap with the link. We had 58 people registered, so we'll be definitely sending this out afterward. And I've added the link to the chat to put your CLE in if anybody would like to do that. I don't know, maybe I'll start with a question, and then definitely would appreciate any thoughts from folks. This was really informative. Do you want to share, a little more? I know you went over some of them, but some of the policy ideas you think could be enacted in the future, and what the challenges are to those ideas?
I would say equitable rate structures. There is such thing as the human right to water that creates a system like similar to what happened in Baltimore, the affordability. I mean, I'm assuming that everybody understands the water affordability system in Philadelphia and in Baltimore. It's kind of like the PIT plan on the energy side, where if you have more money, you pay a little bit more for people that don't. I think that's very promising. Politically, I think that it's not something that everybody's doing and moving fast to do. Yeah, that's one of the first things that come to mind. I mean, throughout this presentation, I think both myself and Jeremy have said that the connection between infrastructure, sanitation is about affordability. So from trying to leverage infrastructure dollars, like the passing of the Lead Service Line and Notification Act, like that's something that gets that affordability a different way, because it's not enough to afford your water if it's killing you. And so those are a couple of things that I think are problems.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, like, I think that's right. I think one of the things we've been seeing is a kind of constitutional right or human right to water legislation kind of moving around the country there. I know California passed a few years ago. I think in New York, I think it's going to be on the ballot in the state of New York, right, which kind of creates a space to say, okay, everybody has an access to these particular environmental protections, including access to clean, affordable drinking water. Now, how do we operationalize that, from the state level to make sure that utilities are being held accountable for providing access, uninterrupted access to affordable water, but then also, as Brianna mentioned, kind of rate structures that, that aren't necessarily, traditionally as they aren't necessarily rooted in usage of water, right? So right now you pay for the amount of water that you consume, right? But figuring out ways, how do we create a structure that takes into account like your income and the need for water, not simply how much you consume. So I think that's going to be critical. And there are places, so that works in some places, it may not work in other places, but in a place like Chicago, for instance, it's a community that has the diversity of income, right, to where a program like that could work very well. Also, thinking of, how do you realign rate structures across other classes too, to make sure that people have, access. So instead of just looking at, these rate structures at residential customers, but how do we look at commercial and industrial customers to make sure that they're also paying their fair share and helping, in subsidizing ways to make sure that individual people who otherwise may not be able to afford it still have access to water.
Thank you so much. Anybody else have any questions that they want to ask? Cool.
I know Eiffel has some links that he'd like to put in the chat. Just put some links in the chat. So just wanted to let everybody know that the links from the presentation are there. So when
Well, thank you. Yeah, just in addition, I think it would be good, one of the things that definitely in policy that has been an issue has been data collection with respect to water affordability. Can maybe one of you just chat about the challenges of data collection and if there are ways to fix that?
I think one of the biggest barriers, and I think it's to, water and utilities, but a number of environmental kind of regulatory areas and one of the biggest barriers is transparency, right? Like lack of information and lack of data to actually assert the claims that we try to make to get action on it, right? So it's hard for me, it's hard for me to say we have a shutoff crisis when the city, a city isn't required to report on shutoffs, or a city isn't required to share that information with the public even through FOIA, right? Like they'll come up with ways to not have to share certain information so that you don't know it, right? So that you can actually make the claim to advocate in a meaningful way for communities that are experiencing, kind of egregious issues of access and affordability. And I think that's, one of the things when we talk about affordability, like transparency is key, like it's critical to that, right? So whatever sort of legislation and policies that are being passed or rules that are being promulgated, like moving forward, they have to have mechanisms that require reporting on very specific information, and that information being, publicly made publicly accessible or outright shared, right? So that people can understand like the issues that are being faced, which will better inform like the solutions to the problem. But yeah, that's always been a critical issue in just environmental enforcement across the board is, there's no accountability on what information needs to be collected and shared, publicly.
Great, thank you so much. Anybody else have questions? Otherwise, I think we could end. I'm sorry for the mishap with the link, but we'll send this out. We'll edit some of me saying that there was no link. And definitely, feel free, for those of you getting CLE from this, make sure you put your link in there, and we'll send this out. I think this was really informative. I really appreciate the presentation. Any last thoughts? This is really great. Oh, I'll share the CLE spreadsheet one more time.
Well, I want to say thanks everybody for showing up and ongoing work to be done and think about. So definitely need thought partners.
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, yeah, thanks for coming out. I'm sure this was probably one of the easier CLEs that are out there. So this was, great to join, and always, great to talk about these issues of justice in particular in this area of work. So thanks for hosting this, Jen.
Yeah, no problem. And I know we have one more CLE in our series left. This time we'll make sure we have the right link out. So definitely appreciate everybody attending, and we'll follow up with all the materials to everybody that registered. So again, thanks so much. And we'll talk with you soon. So bye, everybody.
Thanks, Jen.